Hello. Today I'd like to talk to you about aesthetic experience in general. It's probably something I should have done some time ago, but I wanted to, I don't know, put some of this together as far as some of the things we've been talking about in terms of the history of aesthetics already, uh, and begin to give a bit of an interpretation about aesthetics generally. And I want to talk about, really, I guess, about three basic areas. I want to talk first about what I understand aesthetics to be, because it's not necessarily so clear what the term means. I'd like to talk a little about why we should care about what aesthetics is, because I think that's probably a question you should always ask with regard to these things. And then I'd like to say a little about what I think aesthetics can do for us as human beings and in the human condition. So, to begin with, what is aesthetics? Well, as with most interesting questions in philosophy, this is not an easy thing to answer. And the reason why it's not an easy thing to answer is because of the multitude of ways in which the term itself has been not just defined but approached. It's been taken as an attitude, right, towards our senses. It's been taken as a kind of understanding, a way in which you can think about and take certain things. It's been taken as a way of evaluating, of holding the significance of these things. And all of that, that's just since the 18th century. That's just since the term was technically introduced into the classical philosophical venue, I guess you'd say, terminology, whatever. It's something that, suffice to say, that our encounter with what is the aesthetic is multifaceted, as well it should be. But this makes it very difficult to talk about what it is. And what's more, it's complicated by the fact that underneath the different ways in which the term is talked about, there are deeper ontological and foundational questions about the priorities ascribed to the idea of aesthetic. For instance, you look at someone like Plato. Plato is quite suspicious of the aesthetic. This is part of the reason why he's so big on the censorship of the arts, right? It's because the aesthetic has to do with aesthesis, has to do with the senses. And because it has to do with this, it's something that's really not, you can't trust it, you can't ground it, you can't come to some sort of knowledge that arises out of axiomatic principles with this, because what you come to know with it doesn't stay. On the other hand, you look at someone like Schopenhauer or Nietzsche or some of these romantic thinkers. Well, hell, in order to understand anything, you have to understand it aesthetically, and if you don't, well, you ain't got an understanding. It's true with a lot of Chinese thinkers too. So what place shall we have with it? It's hard to say because you get so many variations. It's tapped so deeply into our experience, into our way of being in the world, that, like, I don't know, maybe an analogy that you could make is, it's something that is so rooted in our base that even slight variations in the trajectory by which you begin to consider the idea is a little like variations within firing a ray out into space. Yeah, maybe there's 1 or 2 degree difference right here, but I'll tell you what, you get past Pluto, big difference, right? Well, so it is with aesthetic interpretations. So it is with the idea of what aesthetics is. A lot of variation precisely because it's so deep. And yet, I do think that there are ways in which we can begin to get into these depths. If I were to try to talk about the idea of what goes into making the aesthetic, I would say that this is a combination of events and circumstances that organically build on each other. That is to say that there's a certain way in which the presence of each augments and transforms the nature of the other, but as these are there in terms of our circumstance, it makes what we call the aesthetic all the more pronounced in our thinking about it. So let me tell you where this is coming from, and you probably will recognize that if you're familiar with these things. There's an awful lot of influence of John Dewey, there's an awful lot of influence of Nietzsche, and there's an awful lot of influence of Elliot Deutsch. within all of these things, as well as a number of others, but I'd say those would be the big three as far as my impact goes. Anyway, probably should throw Merleau-Ponty in there too. He's pretty big too. Anyway, within that, what are these factors that build on each other? Well, the first and probably foremost, I'd say this is the grounding factor, is that we are embodied in this world. For us to be a person, for us to know who and what we are, we have to exist in this body that's, I don't know, between maybe 3 and 7 feet tall, give or take. You know, sometimes you're a little shorter. Maybe you might be a little taller, but you get that. We're a certain weight. We have skin. We see, we smell, we taste, we touch, we hear. We go through life. We feel gravity. We have to nourish ourselves. We go hungry. We have desires. We have fears. We have attractions. We have all these things that come from being embodied in this way. And it is within this situation, this embodiment, and the terms by which this embodiment allows the expression of what one is, that allows us to encounter the world. I mean, those are the terms. That's the name of the game. That's how it happens. It's that fact of embodiment, that fact that our encounter with all of this, consider all the possibility of what you would call real. Our encounter with all of it is mitigated by the fact that I encounter it through this, right? Through the limits and strengths of this body. That, I think, is where aesthetics starts, in the condition of embodiment. Second thing I would say is that this embodiment, in addition to being limited in time and space, encounters the world. Its main medium of encountering the world is sensual. Now, when I say sensual, I don't mean ooh-ah sensual. I mean sensual in the sense of the senses themselves: seeing, tasting, touching, hearing, smelling. Were I to go into other traditions, I might begin to think about memory, about reflection. This is a very important part of the Indian tradition. But they have to do with my physical embodiment being able to encounter the world in a particular way. The fact that I have to do that in order for me to encounter so many things in the world, I have to see them, or taste them, or touch them, or hear them, or smell them. And that shapes the concept and my consciousness and how I'll regard it. Well, this is a basic part of this. Third, as I sense things in the world, I don't simply record these senses, right? I have feelings about them. And because I have these feelings about them, because I have feelings about what I see, because the loveliness of the light makes me wistful or nostalgic, because, as Proust said, the smell drifting down the street suddenly reminded him of a cake that he remembered when he was 4, and all of a sudden all of these memories and senses and associations are unlocked. Because, like Proust, I'm that way. I'm embodied, and I feel like Proust, like every other human being who has ever been embodied in the world. I am in a situation where I am transforming, I'm changing, I'm moving, I'm happening within the process of all of this. So that my aesthetic experience is an experience not just of sensing, but of transformational sensing, of sensing and by virtue of sensing being changed. And I guess maybe this leads to the last important feature of what it is to speak of aesthetics. I'm embodied, one. And in my embodiment, I feel, I sense, 2. And in this sensing, I'm changed, I'm transformed, 3. But in the midst of this sensual transformation, as it were, something else happens. I begin to, and continue to, hold and ascribe aspirations, values, sensibilities. There are things that I hold that are beyond myself, that are real, and that are worthwhile, that are to be loved or feared or aspired toward or pushed away from. Things that help me begin to define what I am in the face of everything else. And not only give aspiration, but even inspiration to me, or perhaps promote a sense of desperation in me. They can do all of these things, right? And how? How do they do this? They do it simply through the fact that I can be touched, that I can be felt, that I can have these encounters with the world in this way. That it makes that kind of a difference. So, so I think these are the features of aesthetics, as it were. There's one more thing I would put into this too. It's worth mentioning, more than worth mentioning, I think it's essential to mention, that the way that we engage aesthetics as human beings seems to be through art. But it's important to recognize that art in itself, that is the way that we tend to think of it, in the sense of being something that is we manufacture and produce and put forward and express or do whatever it is we do. This isn't all there is to what makes art art. Art is something that is both the artist, or it is the artist, it is the work, and it is the audience, and it is the playing of all three in our aesthetic sense of all three. What do I mean by that? Well, I don't know. I mean, think about the way in which people respond to, I don't know, a movie, or a play, or a book, or a piece of music. There's a way, on one hand, in which they respond privately to it. It impacts them personally. They imagine things about their lives. They begin to dream about new sorts of dreams, or suddenly begin to encounter emotions that they hadn't encountered before. But in addition to that, we think about how everyone else around us is reacting to these sorts of things. What does this mean for the zeitgeist, right? The spirit of the time, or any sort of things like that. We wonder what it is that the artist was trying to express to us. Was there a lesson that was being purveyed in some way? Was there something that we could learn? Was there something that we will come to learn later on? The way people talk about The Great Gatsby and saying, oh, I read it when I was 16 and I read it when I was 40 and it made such a difference because it was so different and so wonderful both times. Is it like that? Yeah, it is. It's all those things. And I'll tell you why. The reason why is because fundamentally we are aesthetic beings. We are embodied beings. We are beings that have to exist in this way, that in this situation where we sense, where we care about those senses, where we're transformed by those senses, and where our actions and engagement with the world and what we imagine of the possibilities are shaped by that, right? And art, the whole panoply of possibilities of the art, the artist, and the work, and our encounter with all of that shapes that.